let's go ahead. We're going to just kind of pick up where we left off last week and just kind of catch up for those of you that weren't here last week. We've actually been going through a big series on Old Testament miracles, and last week we started Joseph, and we didn't get very far. We left poor Joseph in the pit last week, and we're kind of sort of going to leave him there this week too, but I want to talk about the pit today. And when I studied this, I was planning on going one way with it because I had some ideas and thoughts, but God had other ideas and thoughts, and it went a totally different way than what I had initially planned. But that's okay, because it was better than what I had planned. Much better. But I want to start kind of back up just a little bit from the pit. Just a little tiny bit. And I want to read the verse basically that came right before the pit. This is Genesis 37, verse 23. Okay. It says, "And it came to pass when Joseph was come unto his brethren, that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him." I remember we talked about last week how Joseph, he kind of had it made. Okay, wealthy family, good status, he had a job, he wasn't worried about his future because he knew what his future held, he had the dreams from the Lord, he was favored and had all these special gifts, including this coat. Okay, and evidently, he wore it all the time, which is kind of like rubbing salt in the wound to these brothers. I mean, it's bad enough that Daddy loves you more. Daddy tells us he loves you more. And then here you wear this coat all the time just to kind of flaunt it, And I don't know that that was Joseph's intention, but it's safe to assume that Joseph had a bit of a pride problem. Okay. We don't like to think about that because Joseph is a good guy. Yeah. But he may not have started out as the good guy. Like I said, it's safe to assume he had a bit of a pride problem. We know he wore the coat. We know that he went, every time he had those dreams, even though his brothers hated him, what'd he go do? I gotta tell you about my dream. God's gonna make me important. I think Joseph had a bit of a pride problem. And I think that this stripping him of his coat is kind of a symbol of God stripping him of his pride. This is his identity. People could see from afar off, they could see that coat of many colors and go, "Oh, look, that's Joseph." Well, without it, he was just like everybody else. And I think it's a very, 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 very vivid picture of stripping that pride away. Because God did have big plans for Joseph. Joseph knew that, and that's okay that Joseph knew that. But I think Joseph got a little bit of a big head about it. And that wasn't okay. So God said, "I'm going to use you, but I have to make you usable first." And when I thought about that, I thought about the verse in Jeremiah 29:11, one of my favorite verses. I know, this is God talking, I know the thoughts that I think toward you. In other versions, this is, I know the plans that I have for you. Okay? God has it already figured out before we were even thought of by our parents. God had it figured out. I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace, not of evil, to give you an expected end. Joseph had that expected end. He knew what to expect because God had told him what to expect. He knew God had plans for him, but he didn't know how he was going to get there. And I don't think he would have ever guessed the road to get there. See, we know God has good plans for us, but we expect the whole road to be all nice and smooth and pleasant and, birds singing and butterflies but it doesn't work that way. But I think that's why God says, but it's not of evil. What's about to happen to Joseph seems very evil. And his brothers meant it for evil, and Joseph tells us that later. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. It's not for evil. No matter how bad it seems. No matter how bad it seems. So God stripped him of his pride, stripped him of who he thought he was. And that's where we get to verse 24. And they took him, his brothers, and cast him into a pit. And the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And we talked just very briefly last week about the pit was empty. Yes and no. Joseph was in the pit. God was in the pit. But nothing else. No distractions. Sometimes God needs to get us to a place where there are no distractions. It's just us and God. Distractions are everywhere. This week seemed to be, I don't know what it was this week. I'd sit down and I'd start something and somebody wanted to text me. And I'm like, okay. And I'd check and make sure it wasn't anything important. And I'd kind of, okay, it's not, I need to finish what I'm doing before I lose my train of thought. I'll get back to them. Well, they just kept texting me. I'm like, stop it. I'm trying to work. And finally, they were like, you doing anything? What you doing? I'm bored. And I'm like, well, I'm not. I'm trying to get some work done, and I'm like, I'm sorry you're bored, but I have work to do. And I don't mean to be rude, And then I was like, yeah, okay, good. Finally got that settled. I'd start something and somebody'd call and I'm like, distractions, and they happen inside, they happen outside, just leaky roof, my broken window, I told you about that, Mitch decided to throw up all over the floor this week. That was a distraction, and that's like, man, but sometimes God just pulls us away from all that. And he says, I'm going to put you right here. It's just me and you. And we think of it as punishment because we're pulled away from all these things that we think we should be doing. But God says, this is our time. This is a privilege, not a punishment. I don't think Joseph was in the pit thinking this was a privilege. But he would later. He'd see it later. But I want to talk about the pit. I told you, I've never been so excited about talking about a pit, but this is good. I like this. Let's talk about the definitions of a pit. I think there was 12 different definitions of a pit. 12. The first one was the obvious. A hole, shaft, or cavity in the ground. Okay, a well, a cistern, a pit. Big hole, An area often sunken or depressed below the adjacent floor area. Where it kind of dips in. That's also known as a pit. But I love the words sunken and depressed. Don't you think that described Joseph? Sunken and depressed. Wow. Joseph was in the pit, feeling like a pit, What beautiful definitions. What beautiful definitions. And those were kind of, like I said, especially the first one was very obvious, There were other definitions like, the pit of a fruit, those kind of things. But then there was this one. A place or situation of futility, misery, or degradation. Wow, that's where Joseph was, wasn't it? Not only was he in a hole in the ground, literally, he was in this kind of pit. A place of situation of futility. It was futile. He was stuck. He couldn't get out. Misery. He was hot. He was thirsty. He was probably hungry. He was alone. Or sort of. He didn't get to eat lunch. Yeah, well, we know they said they went over and ate bread. They're up there eating. He can probably hear them smacking their lips. It's good, Man. And without his coat. There's the degradation. It was degrading to be stripped of his coat. To be thrown in there like trash. It was degrading. But doesn't that kind of go along with the stripping of the pride? Yeah. But it made me think of this, and that was the pits. You ever been in the pits? Life is the pits. Yeah. This is the pits, man. This is the pits. It used to be very popular. It's not as popular anymore, but it used to be very popular. This is the pits. This is the pits, Well, that's what it means. Futile. Miserable. Degrading. I've been in the pits. Anybody else been in the pits? Sometimes you're in the pits for an hour. Sometimes you're in the pits for weeks. And that time of futility and misery and degradation really starts to wear on you. I don't think Joseph had to be in this particular pit very long. Because we know the very next scene he's being pulled out to be sold. But any time in the pit is bad. It's dark, dirty, lonely. It's bad, or at least it feels bad. And that's when we have to keep in mind what God said, not of evil. Sometimes when we're in the pits, we feel like God is out to get us. It's like, God, you're in control, and I know that. So if you're in control, why is all this happening? This is not good. This is evil. This is bad. But all things work together for good. And in the pits is when we have to remember God's promises the most. But it's also when it's the most difficult to remember God's promises and to claim them. It's easy when things are going well. Yeah, God's with me. God's good. God does things for my good. But then in the pits, God, this isn't good. This isn't good. There's one more definition of the pit that I want to talk about, but I'm going to save it for last, and you'll see why in a minute. But I want to talk about some of the attributes of the pit, the descriptions of the pit, okay, before I get to it. Pits are surrounded by high walls, okay. Remember Jericho? We talked about Jericho as it was insurmountable. Remember the one they had to walk around looking up at those walls day after day after day? Don't you know that's what Joseph was doing? How do I get out of here? You can't climb. There's nothing to climb. There's nothing to hold on to. Remember, it's futile. But you're surrounded by those high walls. You ever feel like you're surrounded by high walls and you can't see? You can't see what's behind you. You can't see what's ahead of you. You can't see which way to go. You're just looking around and all you see is walls. It's like, anytime, Lord. I know Taylor's been praying for a job opening, and she's put on Facebook several times, Lord, open a door, and please open a door, Lord, open a door. And sometimes we pray in that, Lord, open a door, and all we see are walls. There's not a single door in sight, just walls. God, I need a door. These aren't doors, these are walls. And God says, I'll give you a door when it's the right door at the right time. So that was the first thing I thought of. Second thing I thought of about pits, they stink. Pits stink. Some pits stink for other reasons. But a pit is a place often of death or decay. Because things fall into a pit and they can't get back out, so they die there. So you know what dead stuff smells like. Oh, I don't think there's a worse smell on earth than something that's dead. But also pits, because they are sunken, they allow water in, but they don't have an outlet. So it just kind of saturates and then it gets stagnant. And stagnant water, that's bad too. So you got dead stuff in stagnant water. Pits stink, man. They stink. That's how we feel when we're in the midst of our trials. This stinks. This is bad. This is terrible. This stinks. But that's okay. There's a remedy. There's a remedy for the stink. And sometimes we just have to do like this poor little man, just grin and bear it. It'll be all right. Just hold on a little bit longer. Because this is where the next attribute comes. The pits force us to look up. Remember it said the pit was empty? So what else did Joseph have to look at? He could look at those walls, or he could look up. He could look up. That's where we get rid of the stink. Because the stink is usually coming from our own attitude more than it's coming from the problem itself. It's our attitude in the midst of the problem that's causing the stink. And it's like, okay, if we start looking up, the attitude changes a little bit. Isn't that what it says in Philippians? Whatsoever things are good, honest, true, lovely. Think on these things. Don't think about the pit. Even if you're in the pit, don't think about the pit. Think about the God Most High, the one who's above the pit, the one who's going to keep his promise that he's doing this for your good. Think on these things. It'll smell a lot better in the pit. It'll smell a lot better. This is the last, I mean, there were more definitions of the pit, but those that were applicable to this. This was one that never crossed my mind until I looked it up. When I looked up the definition for pit, this never, I know it, but it never crossed my mind. And that was when this whole thing took a different turn. The definition of a pit. Any of the areas alongside an auto race course used for refueling and repairing the cars during a race. You know, they go and they have the pit stop. Oh, it blessed my heart. I nearly jumped off the couch yesterday. We think of the pit as a place of punishment, and God says, no. This is being refueled and repaired so you can finish your race. Doesn't the Bible say we're in a race? It does. It says in Hebrews, wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us. There's Joseph's coat. Shoop. And the sin that which there's in the pit. No place to look, no distractions. Let us run with patience the race that's set before us, looking unto Jesus. Where's Jesus? Up. The author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. He was in the pits too, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. That blessed my soul. I thought, oh Lord, how many times have you put me in the pit and I fuss and I whine and I complain and I think I'm being punished for something, and all the while you were doing it for my good. You're saying you need some refueling. You need some repairing. You need to get refreshed before you run anymore. And you know what? Those race car drivers, they don't like being in the pit. Because when they're in the pit, guess what? They're not racing. They're sitting still. Race car drivers don't want to sit still. Hurry up. Let's go. Let's go. Let's hurry this up. Let's do it. But have you ever seen a driver run the race without stopping at the pit? They don't make it. We won't make it either. We can't make it in our race if we don't stop at the pit sometime and get refueled and refreshed and repaired. And sometimes we may have to make more pit stops than others because we need more repairing or more refueling. And we don't want to be there. We're impatient like the race car drivers. Okay, I'm not running the race. I'm not running the race if I'm stuck here. But we can't run the race if we're not. Never thought of that definition of pit. I never thought of it. But it blessed my heart. And then I came across one more verse that reminded me that the pit is not our destination. Okay, that's not the finish line. We finish our race, but that's not at the pit. That's not where the race stops. Okay, it's not our destination. It's just little refueling stops along the way. And I know that because David wrote about it in the Psalms. He brought me up also out of an horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock, Jesus, and established my goings. In other words, he set me back on my racetrack. He pulled me out of the pit. Okay, you're ready. Run some more. That's not to say you're not going to need another pit stop, but run some more. And I'll let you know when you need a break. And I'll repair you and I'll refuel you. And then you'll be good to go again. David wrote that, so he knew. Joseph lived it, but he knew. What about us? Do we know? Next time we're in the pits, which way will we look at it? God, why are you punishing me? Or praise the Lord, I'm getting refueled. I'm getting refreshed. I'm getting replenished. I need it. It's up to us. Pit doesn't have to stink if our attitude doesn't. All right. Just a few minutes over. Well, I told you, I was like, I've never been so happy about a pit, but it's good. God has such good things for us. Oh, it just amazes me. It amazes me. But we do need to go, so let's pray.